Okay, so today we're going to look at absorption costing, which is one of the costing methods that is used in order to calculate the cost of an individual unit of production. So, absorption costing is all to do with apportioning overheads. By apportioning overheads, we mean splitting overheads between different departments. Now, sometimes in accounting, departments are called cost centres, simply because these are areas of the business that can generate costs. So you're going to be required to allocate overhead costs to production departments and to service departments. So there is a difference there between the two. So production departments are those departments that are directly involved in the making of product. Your service departments are those that work around the production departments and help service the production department. So, for example, you might have a production line, a normal production line with all your workers there assembling the products. That is a production department. A service department, it'll be something like HR or marketing, something that doesn't have anything to do with the production of the product in a direct manner. So what we're going to have to do is take those service departments' overheads and allocate them to the production departments using a suitable basis of apportionment, which we call secondary apportionment. One thing that we've got to remember, however, before we get to all that, which is relatively alarming, I'm sure, but the one thing we're going to remember is that fixed costs are going to be allocated to products. Okay, so unlike marginal costing, where we calculate the cost of our variable costs, we then use that to calculate contribution by deducting it from selling price. With absorption costing, what we're going to do is we're going to find out not just our variable costs, but we're going to find out how much of the fixed costs can be ascribed to each individual product. So remember that fixed costs remain the same no matter how many products are made, whilst variable costs change each time a new product. So what I've just said, fixed costs remain the same regardless of output. Variable costs increase with each extra unit produced. Absorption costing is the process of allocating fixed costs to a single unit of production. All right, try and remember that and you'll be okay. So the basic premise of absorption costing relies on a product moving through a factory and visiting each production department as a unit. The total overheads for that department are then allocated to each product based on the amount of time it spends in the department. All right, so this is it's based on time. So the longer you spend in each department, the more of their overheads you get. So we've got a really basic example for you. So we've got a television stand is produced in 3 different departments. So in order to produce one unit, it has variable costs of £12 for labour and £10 for materials. Now, we've then got 3 separate production departments. We've got cutting department, assembling department, and the painting department. It spends an hour, 2 hours, and 3 hours, respectively, in there. Now, if we just think about it very quickly, if we were doing marginal costing, then we would say the marginal cost of the product is 22, which is the 12 plus the 10. And that would be variable costs only. We want to know the full cost of making the product. So we're going to include the fixed costs as well. So each department, each of those 3 production departments has overheads allocated to it, and the total amount of time that the department is operational through the year. So cutting department has £600,000 of overheads, and it has 150,000 operational hours. So that means that it costs £4 for every hour in that department. The assembling department has £1 million worth of overheads allocated to it, and it is operational for 200,000 hours. So therefore, it's £5 for every hour spent in that department. Painting 2,250,000 hours, so £8 per hour. Simples so far. So what we've done there is we've just calculated the overhead cost per hour. If we know the total overheads and we know the total hours that department is open for, we can work out what the overheads are per hour. Relatively straightforward so far. So we can say with the television stand, as it passes through each department, it's going to absorb some of these overheads. So the cutting department, it spends 1 hour in there, and we remember it costs £4 per hour for the fixed costs. So we could allocate £4 to the TV stand. It then spends 2 hours in the assembly department. Now, there was £5 worth of overheads for every hour of the assembly department being open. So if it spends 2 hours there, it takes in £10 worth of their overheads. It then spends 3 hours in the painting department, which the overheads were £8 per hour. So therefore, it's £24 allocated to the TV stand. So we can then calculate its total cost of production. And we can do that by adding the variable costs and the fixed costs together. So we said there was £12 for labour, £10 for materials, 1 hour in the cutting department, so £4, 2 hours in the assembling department, so £10, and 3 hours in the painting department, so £24. So we can say that the total cost of production for one TV stand is £60. That basically is absorption costing in a nutshell. It's a really basic example, but hopefully you see the point. You take the total overheads, the total number of hours that department is open for, divide one by the other, and find the cost per hour. And then for every hour spent in that department, we allocate that to the product. So, getting a bit more difficult now. So, absorption costing is done at the start of the year. It's a method of working out how to cost our products so we can find out our selling price. So, all the costs will be estimated, as will the number of hours. And then we'll apportion the production department's cost using what we call a suitable basis of apportionment. Overheads can then be calculated for each production department, and the management accountants can then calculate what we call an overhead absorption rate, which is the cost per hour for each department. Now, you can call it cost per hour, but in reality, in the exam, you want to call it the overhead absorption rate. And the overhead absorption rate is calculated using either total labour hours or total machine hours. So that's how many hours it's been open. Now, if you're given labour hours and machine hours for a department, don't add them together. What you want to do is just choose the highest one. So if a department uses more labour hours than machine hours, then we call it a labour-intensive department. If it uses more machine hours than labour hours, we call it capital-intensive. Again, these are terms you've got to remember. I'll show you why in a second. So here we've got an example. We've got two departments, machining and assembly. We've got their total overheads for each one, 600,000 for machining and 400,000 for assembly. We've then got total number of hours for machining at 100. Total machine hours are 100,000 hours. And labour hours for assembly is 20,000, and the machine hours in the assembly department are 15,000. Now, we can completely ignore that 15,000 because the labour hours in the assembly department are greater. All right, so we're just going to use the highest of the two. So, moving on. We're going to work out our absorption rate, our overhead absorption rates for each department. So remember that the total overheads for machining were 600,000 and it has a total number of machine hours of 100,000. Therefore, we can say the overhead absorption rate is £6 per machine hour as it is capital intensive. It uses more machine hours than labour hours. For the assembly department, our overheads were 400,000. And this time we're going to divide it by the labour hours, as we remember that was the bigger of the two. And we can say that the overhead absorption rate is £20 per labour hour, as it's labour intensive. Okay, so remember that these are fixed costs though, even though it says per labour hour, that's not what you're paying to your staff. This is just the overheads that have been used. What you pay your staff is a variable cost. Now we can then put that into an example. We've got job X. Now for job X, we use 25 hours of labour at £10 per hour. We use 15 boxes of material at £8 per box and 15 hours of machining. And then we can work out our selling price by marking up on cost by 50%. So we can produce what we call a cost statement, which is just a list of costs, really just a posh word for a list of costs, and calculate the selling price of the job. So first off, we're going to do those variable costs, or sometimes people call them direct costs as well. So 15 boxes at £8 per hour is 120, and the labour that you're going to pay your actual staff, you're paying them £10 per hour. Don't forget, 25 hours of that is £250. That gives us our total variable cost of 370. Again, some people call that prime cost. It's no longer in your specification. I'm just leaving it there because I like the word prime. We're then going to do our overhead absorption rate. And I'm just going to take you back just for a second. Okay, so just back to this. So there's 25 hours of labour at £10 per hour, and there's 15 hours of machining. Now, we've already paid our labour at £10 per hour to our staff, but we've also got to pay the overheads as well as the staff. So when we're calculating our overheads for this job, we know that it uses 15 hours in the machining department, and the machining department OAR, overhead absorption rate, was £6 per hour. That gives us £90 in total. In the assembly department, we're using 25 labour hours. We're paying our staff £10 per hour, but for the overheads, for the fixed costs, it's £20 per hour. So we're going to add that in as well. That'll be another £500. So we can say the 120 plus the 250 plus the 370 plus the 590 gives us £960. So that is the cost of production. If we then add 50% of that to mark up the cost, we can find out our selling price as 1,440. So remember, the key to this is the difference between your variable costs and your overhead or fixed costs. Variable costs have got to be paid to your staff for the materials, and they will change every time you make one extra product. Your overheads don't change with output, but once you know your output, you can divide your overheads by that output to find the cost per hour, and then add it all up, and you can find your total production cost and then your selling price. So don't overthink this. Don't overthink it at all. Just try and find the cost per hour. Work out how many hours the product spends in each department. Multiply one by the other, and Bob's your uncle. So there are some problems with using overhead absorption rates. Can be difficult for business to decide on a suitable absorption rate. It will depend on the type of business. So businesses that are capital intensive, that use a lot of machinery, will use machine hour rate. Businesses that are labour intensive will use a labour hour rate. But neither of those are suitable for any companies in the service sector. So it's very difficult if people aren't physically touching a product to calculate an absorption rate. Now, the other thing, and this is a major limitation, and remember that limitations are super important to us, is that everything is estimated. Remember what I said that earlier? And that can lead us to have inaccuracies in our data. Costs can rise and fall, And therefore, we might overvalue or undervalue our products when we're costing them up if we've got our estimates wrong. So that is your number one limitation right there. Now, a business could charge too much overheads, and we call that over-absorption. It's absorbed too many overheads into the cost of the product. So the production cost is seemingly high, and that's going to give you a high selling price. High selling price can lead to a fall in demand. Alternatively, if you've underestimated your overheads, you will under-absorb costs into the cost of production. That means when you set your selling price, it's going to be too low. And if you're unlucky, you might not cover your costs and the product will be making a loss. So we're actually going to go right back to the beginning now. How do we decide how to allocate overheads to each department? So we've actually done the whole thing, but right at the very beginning, let's just go right back. How did we decide that the overheads for machining department were 600,000 and the overheads for assembly were 400,000? How do we decide that? Well, this is where we come in with our basis of apportionment. Now, you possibly may have to do this in the exam. It's happened a couple of times. You might not. But what you basically try and do is you look at the overhead and then you decide to split that overhead based on various factors, which we call basis of apportionment. So, for example, you might split your indirect wages. Those are wages to non-production staff for each department. You might decide to split that between the department based on the number of employees they have. Your repairs and maintenance might be based on machine hours. Most common is rent and rates and insurance. Now, you do those on floor area. The bigger a department is, the more of the rent it should be taking. Depreciation on machinery should be based on the value of machinery in each department. So it can be relatively straightforward. You've just got to be really logical when deciding how to split it up. So here is an example of that. So we've got 3 departments. We've got 2 production departments, and then we've got 1 service department. We've got repairs at the end there. Now, for each department, we're given a bit of information. Given the number of employees, the area, so how much of our factory does each department take up, the cost of machinery in each department, and we've also got our labour hours in there as well. We're then going to do this secondary apportionment where we take the service department's overheads and we're going to assign them to the production departments. And we're going to do that 70 to production and 30 to assembly. And we've got the following overheads for each department. So salaries are 600,000, rent is 280, heat and light 56, machinery 40. So what we're going to do is we're going to split these 4 overheads between these 3 departments. And we're going to use this information at the top of the slide to decide how we're going to do it. So first thing we do is we list our costs down the side. And at the top there, we've got each of our departments. Now, salaries, we're going to base on the employees. Now, the total for that was 600,000. I'm going to go back 1 slide now. Remember, so there was 400 in the production department, 100 employees in the assembly, 80 in the repairs department. So 600,000, we're going to split 400, 120, 80. Because it goes directly into 600,000. For the rent, it was 280,000. We're going to do that on floor area. Again, I'm just going to go back a slide. So 70,000, 40,000, 30,000 is the area that each department takes up. So 70, 110, 140, right? 140, right? So therefore, we can split that. Oops. We can split the 280, 70, 40, 30, which gives us 140, 80, 60. So we use the basis of apportionment as the ratio to split up the total overhead. Do the same with the heat and the same with the insurance. You simply take the total overhead, divide it by the total of the floor area. So in this one, we're using floor area. So 70 plus 40 plus 30 gives us 140,000. What we do, what we would do is take 280 divided by 140,000, which is the total floor area, and then multiply that answer by 70,000 for the production department, by 40,000 for the assembly, and by 30,000 for the repairs. So we use each basis of apportionment as a ratio to split up the total overhead. Okay, the most important thing to do is just get the right basis of apportionment, and you can do that based on just basic logic. What's the best way to split up rent? Well, it's not going to be on number of employees, it's going to be on floor area. Heat moves, it goes around the building. The more area you've got, the more heat you need. Fairly logical. Insurance, you do it on the cost of the assets within the department. So, and then you just use the ratio for each department to calculate it all. Now, once you've done that, you can find the total for each department. But we've got to find the total for repairs first, which was 160,000. And then if we remember, we were splitting that 70-30 between production and assembly. 160,000 divided by 100 times by 70 is 112, that's by 30 is 48. And then we add that to the total overheads for each department. And then we won't have any overheads left in repairs. We've only got overheads for production and assembly. Once we've got that, we can simply divide it by the labour hours we were given for each department to find our overhead absorption rates. So total for production was 694. There were 80,000 labour hours to give us £8.68 per labour hour. In the assembly department, it was 282,000, and there was 100,000 labour hours, so it's £2.82 per labour hour. And that's really it. You then add those to your variable costs and you find the total cost of production. Okay, I understand that's difficult. Make sure you watch this video a couple of times. Make sure you can fully understand it. Any problems, give me a shout.